just when you thought it was safe to hear a podcast promo.
JL May do brave and bold do comic books do JL May.
JL May do brave and the bold do comic books do JL May. JL May do brave and the bold do comic books do JL May. JL May do brave and bold do comic books do JL May.
The annual podcast crossover event celebrating the Justice League is back. And we're covering the 2007 Brave and the Bold series that started with Mark Waid and George freaking Perez and ended with J. Michael Straczynski. Throughout the month of May, participating podcasts will release special episodes on issues in the run. It all kicks off in the Overlooked Dark Knight podcast. Follow the event on social media using the hashtag JLMay2023. Coming this May.
JL May do brave and the bold do comic books do Mephisto. Hey! That it? Is that what you want?
Things I do for this show.
As our story opens, our hero, Dan Garrett, is visiting his friend and secret advisor, Dr. Franz, who operates a little apothecary shop in one of the great city's side streets. He is restlessly pacing the floor in Dr. Franz's living room.
Look, Doc, why does there have to be so much red tape in police work?
Well, Danny, every organization has to have rules and regulations. That makes for efficiency.
Yes, but the criminals and the crooks we're set to catch aren't bound up in rules and regulations. You know, I like police work, but I also crave action.
You seem to get plenty of it as the Blue Beetle. I worry about you, Danny. The terrible risks you take. These crooks and gangsters are vicious, cold-blooded killers. They'd have no mercy on you if they caught you.
I can take care of myself. Besides, that suit of blue chain armor you made me and that mask are a great protection.
I hope they never catch you without it, or ever discover who the Blue Beetle really is. I'm afraid it would mean the end of Patrolman Dan Garrett.
Well, after all, Doc, you're the only one who knows. Even Mannigan is always saying what he'd do if he caught the Blue Beetle.
He's the officer on the beat next to yours, isn't he?
Yes, he was my father's pal. He got me on the police force after my father was killed by a gangster's bullet.
And doesn't he suspect at all?
No, he doesn't. He's a good cop, but he's not very heavy above the ears.
Blue Beetle is one of the top 10 superheroes of all time. This is not an opinion, but a verifiable fact. Superman is the number 1 superhero, and Blue Beetle was the number 10. Nobody thinks of Zatar as a superhero, just a super magician. Centaur's the Arrow clearly owed a debt to the bloodthirsty pulp vigilantes like the Shadow, but he wore a flamboyant costume and demonstrated physical prowess well beyond anything that could reasonably be considered normal for a human being. The Crimson Avenger was much more grounded in the pulps and didn't don a costume until much later, so he barely sneaks in as DC's first masked hero. Namor's bona fides as a protagonist are disputable, but his superhuman abilities are not. Batman is one of the most famous superheroes of all time, and Fox's Wonder Man was so close to Superman that he was successfully sued out of existence. The Flame essentially replaced Wonder Man in his own book, and was different enough from National's heroes who survived for a few years. The Sandman is another one that could be dismissed as a suit-wearing playboy with a gimmick and a gas mask, but he did eventually don spandex. Centaur's Phantom of the Fair was very much Batman plus Superman. And then we get to number 10, one Dan Garrett, a blatant ripoff of radio's Green Hornet. I mean, Blue Beetle. The math isn't hard. He was just a guy in a blue suit with a hat who fought crime. It soon became apparent that superheroes were selling better than plainclothes vigilantes, so he put on some chainmail and jumped around more. Also, technically, he was a rogue cop, dispensing extrajudicial justice, which sure wouldn't play in Portland today. Here's an excerpt from the article Kill, Hiss the Villain as I Shuddered and Listened by Chris Steinbrunner, collected in Krause Publications, The Comic Book Book. Considering the rich variety of source material, surprisingly few costume heroes from the comics joined Superman on radio. Not even Batman was to have a radio show of his own. His triumph on television came in a later epoch. Some bright costume figures tried hard, though. The Blue Beetle started each show amid police whistles and organ sirens with this overwhelming exposition.
sweeping down upon the underworld to smash gangland comes
The friend of the unfortunate, enemy of criminals. A mysterious, all-powerful character with a problem to the police. A crusader for law. In reality, Dan Garrett, a rookie patrolman, loved by everyone but suspected by none of being the Blue Beetle. As the Blue Beetle, he hides behind a strange mask and a suit of impenetrable blue chain armor, flexible as silk, but stronger than steel.
Unfortunately, his adventures often generated less excitement than this heavy introduction, and Beetle expired after a brief radio lifespan in the early 40s. Interestingly, he carefully avoided victimless crimes. A mere case of missing jewels were out of the Blue Beetle's line. No unfortunate individual is involved. Garrett eventually started taking a vitamin that made him Captain America, and then started dating Vicky Vale. It was enough to get him a solo title, a short-lived newspaper strip, and a radio show. From the comic book, the article The Second Banana Strikes Again by Ron Gillard. The insect world inspired a good many heroes. The Green Hornet was the most prominent of these. Actually, the Hornet was too conservative for comic pages, which is why he did much better on radio than in funny books. He preferred driving an automobile to bounding over rooftops. For a costume, he ignored capes and boots to fight crime in a slouch hat and an overcoat. Much more flamboyant and irrational was the Blue Beetle. He came along in the summer of 1939, a star of a Fox magazine called Mystery Men Comics. The Beetle was one of the few superheroes who acquired his powers through attention to his diet. Blurbs continually reminded us he was given super energy by vitamin 2X. He wore a special costume of blue chainmail, making him almost invulnerable. While some heroes had crack scientists for mentors, or at least mad doctors, the Blue Beetle settled for a druggist. Apparently it never occurred to him to buy up 2X in quantity, so every time he wanted to become super, he had to drop into the neighborhood drugstore to get his prescription filled by Dr. Franz. In everyday life, the Beetle was an impatient rookie cop named Dan Garrett, and I had the impression that he left his hero costume hanging in what the scripts referred to as the back room of a drugstore. It's also possible that Dr. Franz's drugstore was a chain operation, since Dr. Franz would be a thin man with glasses in one issue and a fat fellow with a beard the next. Once powered by 2X, the Blue Beetle would run around for 8 or 10 pages, cracking skulls and attempting wisecracks, while he hunted down such villains as the Wart, Scrag, the Eel, Dr. Downhill, and a crazed scientist called Doc. The Beetle was especially fond of lying out flat on roofs and ledges, then dropping down on surprise thugs. Now and then he would scare his foes with the sign of the Blue Beetle, a little blue scarab he would leave on desks and tabletops, or, when in a whimsical mood, lower into a room on the end of a string. Fox Features Syndicate threw some money around to get him exposure at events like the World's Fair. Blue Beetle was a rare hero to survive the World War II slump into the 1950s, and even after Fox folded, enjoyed multiple brief revivals at new publisher Charlton Comics. He was no Captain Marvel, but he did alright for himself and probably deserves more respect in the grand scheme of comics. Gina Maziroglu wrote an entry for Blue Beetle in the superhero book, The Ultimate Encyclopedia of Comic Book Icons and Hollywood Heroes, 2nd edition. The Blue Beetle was the second superhero to have his own comic, and went on to more changes and publishers, 6 in all, than almost any other character in comics history. He also spanned a quality spectrum from excellent to absolutely awful. In 1939, Victor Fox was an accountant at DC Comics who had noticed with envy the profits coming in from the company's new Superman character. Moving to a different floor in the same building, he set up his own company, Fox Comics, and hired the Will Eisner Jerry Iger creative shop to provide the story and artwork for his new venture. Unfortunately, his first character, Wonder Man, was immediately hit by a lawsuit from DC, and so they quickly dreamed up a new hero, the Blue Beetle. In his first appearance, drawn by Charles Nicholas in Mystery Men Comics #1, the Beetle was little more than a Green Hornet clone, but he was soon given a blue chainmail costume and a mask and hood, topped off with antenna. The latter sadly disappeared by his 4th strip. In his civilian identity, the Beetle was rookie cop Dan Garrett, whose athletic prowess made him a powerful hero as soon as he donned his costume, though the gun he toted in the early days probably helped. As far as superpowers go, he really had none, although he often projected his Beetle insignia on dark walls. Soon he was given a girlfriend, reporter Joan Mason, and a special vitamin mixture, 2X, that beefed up his muscles. The Blue Beetle briefly had his own radio show and newspaper strip, but the poor overall quality of Fox's product led the company to close shop in 1942. A few months later, the Beetle was back on the stands, this time published by Fox's printers, Holyoke, who, historians believe, took over the character in lieu of debts. The Holyoke years saw the character gain a sidekick called Spunky, which didn't help, as the strip got even worse. By 1944, Victor Fox had come back into publishing and took over the comic again for a series of catastrophically awful strips in which the Beetle could suddenly fly and also mysteriously acquire the Beetlemobile and Beetle Boat. One of the hottest comics of the post-war years was the ultra-violent Crime Does Not pay. And in 1946, Fox decided to get a piece of that action. The new direction concentrated more on the Blue Beetle's shapely girlfriend and featured a series of so-called true crime stories, which were little more than an excuse for acres of flesh and gallons of blood. Story titles such as Satan's Circus, The Vanishing Nude, and House of a Thousand Corpses tell it all. By the end of the decade, Fox had left comics forever, but the Beetle was soon picked up by the bargain basement publisher Charlton, who brought out a few nondescript issues in 1955. Somehow, IW Comics got their hands on some old artwork and, in 1964, released it in 2 issues inexplicably retitled The Human Fly. That same year, Charlton was back again with a 10-issue run of staggeringly silly strips, in which the beefed-up hero appeared to resemble the Pillsbury Doughboy.
Hello and welcome to the Overlooked Dark Knight, a non-index show. And I say that because we are hopefully getting some new listeners, as this episode of the Overlooked Dark Knight is the kickoff to this year's J.L. May. My name is Michael Bailey, and with me is my co-host Andrew Leyland.
Hello.
And for the past 6 years or so, we occasionally get together, and the idea is to talk about Batman stories that not a lot of people talk about, and about 50% of the time we hit that.
Yeah, every now and again we actually do the remit of the show.
Mainly it's an excuse for Andy and I to talk Batman, and to finally do a show together. This year, we are looking at the Brave and the Bold series that DC published starting in 2007, originally written by Mark Waid, then eventually written by J. Michael Straczynski. I remember this being a huge deal, though, because it was Mark Waid, it was George Perez,
Green Lantern, Batman,
and it was bringing back the idea of Brave and the Bold, the idea of a team-up book in a modern context. So we decided to not only look at the first issue of Brave and the Bold, which is what we're supposed to be doing as part of JLMA, but on the back end of the episode, we're going to be talking about a Brave and the Bold issue from 1981 that is definitely a comic book that is 17 pages long.
1981?
Mm-hmm.
I would have swore that was 1974.
Feels like it, doesn't it?
The Brave and the Bold #1 came out, as Micah said, in April of 2007.
Excerpt from the superhero book, The Ultimate Encyclopedia of Comic Book Icons and Hollywood Heroes, 2nd edition, by Gina Misiroglu, Milestone Heroes. It is common for comics companies to give themselves exalted names, but in the case of Milestone, the point was particularly well taken. Debuting in 1993, it was the first comics company established by African Americans and devoted to superheroes of color. Seeking strength and normalcy in numbers, Milestone's founders, writer Dwayne McDuffie, artist Dennis Cowan, business writer Derek Dingle, and briefly Michael Davis, future head of Motown Animation, decided to launch an entire line of superheroes, rather than a single character, aiming to reflect the range of real life, and not just put one more token minority super being on the shelves. The ambitious scope helped guarantee that none of Milestone's comics would seem to be a gimmick, even as the creator's perspective helped assure a certain uniqueness, presenting ideas and issues seldom seen in mainstream superhero comics, and hardly ever handled as credibly as Milestone did. Milestone had standards of quality, and a level of freshness and wit that stood above much else that was produced during an early to mid-1990s glut of new, though not often original, superheroes. The comic setting itself is unusual for the New York-centric normal superhero stories. Milestone's tales take place in the fictional Midwestern metropolis of Dakota. Excerpt from the comic book Heroes, the first history of modern comic books, from the Silver Age to the present, by Gerard Jones and Will Jacobs. A group of prominent black creators entered into a deal with DC for a line of non-white urban superheroes. Everyone was getting excited and getting scared about the coming flood of heroes. The DC-allied companies kicked it off with Hardware, Blood Syndicate, Icon, and Static. Most of the series fell into the traps and tropes familiar from Image and Marvel, but they were well textured by Cowan's punchy superhero designs, done about the same time he was designing the hero for TV's Mantis, and McDuffie's fast, funny, slang-rich writing. The characters were uncommonly human, and the stories were wrapped in slick bits of comic book self-reference. But sales were only decent, too specific of markets at industry insiders, trying to convince themselves the conditions were fundamentally sound. Hardware created by Dwayne McDuffie, Derek T. Dingle, Dennis Cowan, and Michael Davis. Curtis Metcalf is the most brilliant inventor alive. His boss, Edwin Alva, is the biggest criminal alive. As Hardware, the high-tech hero, Kurt wages all-out war against the man he may never defeat. After a hard day's work, a step through Hardware's shell forge seals Kurt inside a protective bodysuit, many times tougher than Kevlar. From deep within the bowels of the Mason building, headquarters of Alva Technologies, Hardware deploys his secret nighttime arsenal of plasma cannons, inertia winders, and liquid metal alloys in his single-minded quest for vengeance. Hardware #1 was released on February 23rd, 1993, marking the debut of the African-American co-owned and operated Milestone Media via DC Comics 30 years ago. Hardware number 1 starts with a very powerful metaphor. The protagonist's childhood pet bird often tries to escape while its cage is being cleaned, but just smashes into a window that it cannot perceive. My bird made a common error. He mistook being out of his cage for being free. Curtis Metcalf is a brilliant young man, scouted as a child at an inner-city grade school science fair by the world's most famous inventor, Edwin Alva, who proceeds to offer him a free ride through private school and college, from which he's already agreed at age 15. Metcalf is put to work in Alva's research and development department, and is soon seen as the heir apparent. Eventually, Metcalf thinks he deserves a tiny nibble of the pie he's enriching, and is essentially told by Alva that he's just a tool, a cog in his machine. In other words, the parakeet. The price of Metcalf's free ride is his freedom. He's locked in an ironclad lifetime no-compete. Looking for leverage to blackmail his way out, Metcalf uncovers Alva's vast criminal empire. He anonymously alerts all major media and authorities, but no one bites. Alva's Teflon. Trapped working for an evil empire run by an untouchable master, Metcalf turns Alva's own vast resources against him as the violent vigilante Hardware. Within a resilient artificial ebony skin, he chops and kills his way through Alva's network. The second issue shifts perspective to the Lex Luthor of Dakota, Edwin Alva. So blinded by his racism, he can't see Hardware as the source of his financial woes, only the tool of some greater power aligned against his rightful dominion. Alva dispatches a self-replicating assassin known as Reprise. Blonde-haired fella, ugly, sunglasses, vest, usually runs around with a double-barreled shotgun, and everything he wears and all of his tools also replicate. We get a bit more information on how Hardware operates. He gives voice command orders to the OBIE operating system, that's OBIE. It's short for onboard computer. Hardware's computer is scattered about his person. The wafer-thin CPU is generally on his hip, and up to 6 separate hard drives are worn strapped or otherwise attached to his costume at various points. While Obi can output to practically any monitor, such as the various displays in Hardware's vehicles, normally Hardware views the computer output with a heads-up display projected onto his retina. Obi's output is fully visible to Hardware, tucked into a corner of his field of vision, but completely invisible to anyone else. So in this sense, very much a precursor to the heads-up display we see Iron Man use in the movies. Hardware favors using a plasma whip as his main tool. Hardware's expandable whip is actually a telescoping metal chain, 10 inches long when collapsed, up to 15 feet long when fully extended. It can be charged at its tip with high-energy plasma. He also often uses a retractable sword. The 18-inch wrist-mounted blade is worn under the arm. The heavier 30-inch blade attaches to the outside of the forearm. The status of his weapons and systems are constantly updated in captions, and when he runs low on power, he has to go analog. Overwhelmed by Reprise, Hardware has to remote control his Skylark aircraft to escape. Skylark is Hardware's primary transport vehicle, a flying car. It is a refinement of the Moeller Sky Car, a contemporary levitation vehicle. The Skylark has vertical takeoff and landing capabilities and travels at up to 400 miles per hour, either high in the sky or skimming low to the ground. The Skylark can also hover. It seats 4, has a heads-up windshield display, and adjustable wavelength headlights, ultraviolet for increased visibility in low light and high fog conditions, infrared for zero light conditions. Its windows are bulletproof. Its chassis is bullet resistant. The Skylark is equipped with state-of-the-art, onboard crime-fighting gear and is often modified to interact with additional equipment. Missing in action, recovering from injuries in his apartment, work calls Curtis's friend Baraki Young, who busts him wearing shell-forged skin in bed. He comes clean over a span of hours, and she angrily storms out. Metcalf decides it's time to kill Alva rather than continue hacking his forces. Hardware has worked everything out and how his confrontation with Edwin Alva should play out, and yet he hesitates to pull either the figurative or literal trigger. He has a trick where he pours his liquid skin into locks, then polarizes it into a perfectly fitting key. That's probably how he lets himself into the home of Baraki Young, who has feelings for Curtis, but Metcalf insists on keeping his only platonic friend. He wants her approval to go after Alva, but she refuses to get sucked into his vendetta. When Hardware does strike, it's with a notably softer touch. No fatalities, non-lethal methods. Refusing Alva's bribes, Hardware instead batters his former father figure, swearing to destroy his empire and draw out his eventual death.
I couldn't crack the security on your computer, not at the time available, so I copied everything. I'll browse through that stuff at my leisure. With that information, I'm going to take your organization apart, piece by piece. When I'm finished with you, you'll be living on the street. And one night, as you're scrounging for a meal from a garbage can, cursing the day you ever heard my name. One night, after you realize you're as low as you can go, and that I'm the one who put you there, I'll walk up to you, drop a nickel in your beggar's cup, and then I'll kill you.
Frustrating all of us Scott Evils out there, the initial 4-part Hardware story arc ends with our protagonist allowing Alva to live, then fending off his own Ed 209 or T1000, a seemingly bigger, badder version of himself that Hardware outwits and enslaves. Hardware will continue to clash with the Illuminati-like system Alva has ties to, and also buys a free-range parakeet to ultimately still cage in his apartment, where it will poop on everything. Still my favorite Milestone title, but strained muscles reaching for that metaphor.
Hello and welcome to Dial F for Flanger, it's a chat show. I can do whatever I want. And this time what I want is to talk about something to do with May. May is back. It's May, and we're talking about the Justice League, sort of. I have a comic, and we're going to discuss it. It has two people on the front. One is Green Lantern, and the other is Supergirl. And if you talk about most things Supergirl, you're a fool if you don't try and get this fellow. And I've got Dr. Ange here to talk about Supergirl. Now, if you don't know who Dr. Ange is, he is the, I'm going to say award-winning, even if it's true or not. You're the award-winning blogger about Supergirl. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. I'm very excited to talk about this issue. You know, I've been doing my site for a long time, and somehow I've never covered this issue on the site. So this will be the first time that I'm talking about it at length.
What? We're just going to talk about issue 2. Is this like the secret George Perez project that no one really talks about?
You know, it's crazy because I do think that nobody talks about it, and he really covers lots of areas of the DC universe, so you'd think that it would have more renown. There's a lot of guest stars in this, and he brings the same energy that he brings to other big projects to this. If you're talking about great page layouts and inset panels and crazy detail, it's amazing work. And you find these issues in the dollar box everywhere. Like, I don't understand at all.
It was like it just wasn't cool when it happened. To me, it's knocking it out of the park. It's a number one comic across the board. Do what you got to do, everyone.
And take care.
After Spider-Man co-creator Steve Ditko quit Marvel in a huff, he returned to the dirtbag, probably mob-affiliated Charlton, and intended to do for them what Jack Kirby had done for Marvel. Problem being, as much of a Bob Kane as he could be regarding creative credit at times, Stan Lee was still a big part of the Marvel magic. Jack probably didn't learn that lesson back at DC with the Fourth World Saga, and Ditko definitely didn't with his wing of the Charlton action heroes, which is why the word disgruntled inevitably comes up the longer you talk about either of their careers. It's hard not to see Ditko's tug of war with Lee over the direction of Peter Parker, given Ditko's contempt for heroes with feet of clay, thrust into responsibility by gifted power, and not imagine him seeing a revamp of Blue Beetle as finally doing Spider-Man right. Ditko is a Randian objectivist who firmly believed in American exceptionalism, the self-made man who was a brilliant inventor and successful industrialist that created a superheroic persona from scratch, and not have it handed to him by fate. Well, except for the part where the identity was almost but not quite literally handed to him. You see, in a parallel today, cops were not popular with the youth of the 1960s. Dan Garrett had gained or lost the T in his name, I forget which, and over time his entire backstory was changed. Now he was an archaeologist who gained the power and appearance of the Blue Beetle from a mystical Egyptian scarab. Ted Kord was his friend, and similar to DC's Green Lantern, Dan Garrett tried to pass on the scarab after he was mortally injured by a threat. Unfortunately, there was interference in the handoff, the scarab was lost, and Kord decided he would use his technological resources to carry on the Blue Beetle legacy without it. The redesigned Ditko Blue Beetle was the backup feature in a handful of Captain Atom issues before getting a solo series that hosted the Questions backups. It only lasted 5 issues before Charlton decided the Batmania money was never coming and the line was done in 1968. He and the other action heroes made very few appearances over the next couple of decades, mostly limited to fanzines, or at best barely professional work, as was the Charlton way. Returning to Gina Maziroglu's The Superhero Book, then something strange happened. The Blue Beetle finally started some good stories. Very good stories, in fact. Soon after leaving his astonishingly successful Spider-Man comic, artist Steve Ditko moved over to Charlton and completely revamped the Beetle. Ditko's hero was now scientist Ted Kord, and he had a stylish new costume, his own designer flying vehicle, in the shape of a beetle of course, and genuinely exciting, well-drawn stories. Inexplicably, despite action scenes that rivaled Spider-Man at his best, the public simply wasn't interested, and the comic was cancelled after barely a year. A generation later, a few fans who bought Ditko's issues were creating comics of their own, and the first of many revivals saw print in 1981 in the semi-pro Charlton Bullseye. A few years later, another fan publication, Americomics, pitted the Blue Beetles against each other in pitched battle. Before things came full circle in DC Comics, the impetus for the Beetles' creation in the first place, bought the rights to the character. For much of the 1980s, he starred in amiable yarns in his own comic and enjoyed great success in one of several incarnations of the Justice League. He was frequently teamed with his best friend in the League, Booster Gold, the time-traveling hero from the 25th century, who was created by Dan Jurgens in Booster Gold #1, February 1986. I had limited access to Charlton comics as a kid, so unlike most readers, I was initially more familiar with Peter Cannon Thunderbolt, Judo Master and Tiger, Sarge Steel, and Sentinels than Blue Beetle, Captain Atom, or the Peacemaker, who I only saw in a house ad. I think I recall seeing the issue of AC's America Comics where revived Dan Garrett fought Ted Kord for the title, but very shortly after, the property was sold to DC Comics, and that Splinter continuity was plucked in the bud. Dick Giordano had been a creator and editor at Charlton early in his career before moving to DC in the 1970s, and eventually joined the triumvirate of Jeanette Kahn and Paul Levitz that ran that company into the 21st century. By the mid-80s, Archie Comics had once again tried and failed to revive their Golden and Silver Age superhero lines, and a bunch of outfits, tangentially including Archie, were fighting over the rights of the 60s Tower Comics properties. It may be hard to imagine now, but there was a time when the Mighty Crusaders and Thunder Agents were much better known and more highly valued than any of Charlton's original heroes, while John Carbonaro, through sheer legal tenacity, managed to claw back the copyright to the Tower properties that should otherwise clearly be in the public domain. No such effort was ever made when Charlton pulled a Night of the Living Dead in failing to assert such claims from the very beginning. That's probably why DC was reportedly able to buy the action hero trademarks as a gift for valued employee Giordano for a paltry few $1,000s. DC went on to radically reinvent the properties, both by name and as the inspiration for Alan Moore and Dave Gibbons' Watchmen. Sure, you could use Captain Atom in a story, but you couldn't in any way advertise the character's use by that name because of trademarks. You would also have to call him Alan Atom rather than the now better known Nathaniel Atom used at DC, and certainly couldn't make him silvery all over or in any way reference anything quantum. Obviously, Ant-Man can quantum all day and night, but a character named Captain Atom tapping the quantum field would be a lawsuit waiting to happen. DC were maybe not as smart with Blue Beetle. Although I never found either Blue Beetle's look to be anything to write home about, the Ditko redesign was beloved by creators of a certain age, and nobody seemed to want to deviate far from his premise. Beetle was present in the one issue of Crisis on Infinite Earths that I read as a child, and I recall flipping through his reintroduction to comics in the second issue of the 1986 Secret Origins revival at a mall bookstore. I might have also seen the first issue of his new ongoing series by Len Wein and Paris Cullens. I had some curiosity because of that sliver of Charlton exposure, but neither comic made it home with me. I think my best friend got a bunch of early issues and a grocery sack full of gifted comics, but they didn't interest me. I picked up a bunch of Millennium tie-ins off the newsstand in 1988, but passed on the Blue Beetle ones. As an adult in the 90s, I got a few on the cheap, and I wasn't feeling them at all. I bought a dented discount copy of Justice League International number 8 in 1987, the famed Moving Day issue, and loved it to pieces. I bought the title sporadically in the teens, monthly in the 20s, dropped it almost immediately in the 30s, returning for the breakdown story arc in the 50s. I was a fair weather fan of the title, at best. The first time I dropped it was because the artist Kevin Maguire was absent too long, and I disliked his fill-ins. I was more committed when he left the title permanently with number 24, yet still never warming to his replacement. In retrospect, though, there was another problem. When I dipped in for number 16, Maguire was there, but it was an espionage story with a plainclothes Bruce Wayne, Beat Acosta, Booster Gold, and Ted Kord. It just wasn't enough there for me. I skipped number 25, a cover featured Blue Beetle Spotlight. Number 26 through 29 was a story arc involving a homicidal Manchurian Blue Beetle being deprogrammed after trauma he'd experienced in the Mist number 17. The book had become much grimmer, and I didn't like the art, prompting my departure even as Adam Hughes was coming in. I wasn't conscious of it, but I think I had a problem with Blue Beetle. Booster, Beetle, Fire, Ice, and Green Lantern Guy Gardner began to dominate the JLI. And of those four, I only really liked Guy. I loved Justice League International as a superhero book with a lot of humor, but over time it became a sitcom that happened to feature superheroes. I never felt like any of that quintet measured up on the superhero front, and certainly didn't rate the prestige that should come with being a Justice Leaguer, before every superhero was automatically either a Leaguer or an Avenger. Guy at least was uniquely antagonistic, and a genuine source of belly laughs. He was a Mr. Roper or a Furley, and I guess Ice could be a Chrissy Snow, but the rest were Janet, Terry, and Cindy, the third wheels. As much love as the Blue and Gold get in fan circles, with rare exceptions, I found them to be basic bosom buddies, and the most deserving of the contempt directed at the JLI on the respectability front. I bought Booster Gold number 1, and immediately took a dislike to that character. Ted befriending Booster reflected badly on him, and where others see lovable losers, I only got half the equation. In particular, I never forgave them for the Kui 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 debacle, which I read as back issues. These supposed superheroes embezzled millions of dollars to build a casino casino, and their only punishment seemed to be washing dishes, which Booster ultimately decided was beneath him and quit the team. Both of those guys should have been sent to prison, not put on KP. Yes, I know Maxwell Lord eventually turned out to be evil, and sure, eat the rich, but they're still a pair of thieving crooks. They disgust me. Ted Cord stayed on for Dan Jurgens' mostly lousy league years, the extremely bad Dan Votto run, and then on to the unfunny punchline that was Extreme Justice. Less said about lethal assault weapons, a Charlton Action Heroes revival, the better. The JLI got a pair of pretty great reunion miniseries where ridiculing Booster's shamelessness was one of the better gags, but Beetle was played much too straight. From there, he had a bit supporting role in Birds of Prey, where he failed to compete for Barbara Gordon's affections and developed a debilitating heart condition. Finally, he was killed by Max Lord during his big heel turn in the countdown to 2005's Infinite Crisis. Again, Blue Beetle gave his life to serve as a jobber to prop up the villainy of Maxwell Lord IV, of all people, and also to give Booster Gold a bit of pathos. What a pathetic fate.
This is the Bat Pod.
Grab your bat microphone, it's time to start the show.
Welcome to the Bat Pod, a Batman comic book discussion podcast. We're going to be discussing Brave and the Bold, Volume 3, Number 3. My name is Bill Beer, and joining me, the alien scarab of the Bat Pod, J. David Wheaton.
That was awesome. I didn't know where you were going, but that was awesome.
Love it, drop the facade. Like the Dark Knight detective, they've got some perspective. They're a pure crime-fighting collective. It's the Bat Pod.
Next issue. Deacon Stewart is a brilliant programmer and telecommunications expert that Curtis Metcalf knew briefly in college, but he flunked out of University of Michigan's structured environment. As hardware, they reconnected to help build digital infrastructure for the crusade. When a prostitute Stewart was in a relationship with turns up murdered by a known prolific serial killer, the police are quick to pin it on the unwitting John. He reaches out to Hardware on his untraceable phone line, who calls in a favor from a high-powered lawyer named Freeman. Following the subtle universe-building cameo, Hardware picks up the sprung Stewart in a car that projects holographic passengers. Our genius hero recognizes that detective isn't in his skill set, so he'll need Stewart's help to raid police databases on the killings. Hardware visits the crime scene, realizing he doesn't really know what he's doing there. Neither does Death Wish, Dakota's answer to the Punisher, with more torture and a tendency to throw suspects a gun with the option to just kill themselves. Try shooting him and die slowly. Besides being an obvious psycho, Death Wish also appears to have superhuman strength, speed, and durability. Hardware is on the ropes until he uses polarized liquid metal to trap Death Wish shoes to the floor and socks him. Hardware tries to enlist or otherwise compel Death Wish's aid in the investigation, but is rebuffed. However, a tracking device was planted in his trench coat, and based on the smell, he doesn't change clothes often. Death Wish's ability to track down sex offenders seems to be a takes one to know one situation. He brandishes a knife to show a lady he's manly after a bout of erectile dysfunction, but Hardware intercedes. Not the first time that's happened. Is he the serial killer though? With considerable effort, Hardware was finally able to subdue and shock to his senses Death Wish via taser. Then the sob story came. He was a family man forced to watch the rape and murder of his wife and son, then his own violation and attempted execution by shotgun to the head. Following a lengthy rehab, he transformed into Death Wish, and after 2 years finally caught and killed his assailant. However, the experience had left him impotent, and he started going into a fugue state, murdering the prostitutes that couldn't revive his manhood. Death Wish turned himself into Hardware and police, commenting on how alike they were. Curtis hadn't slept in 5 days, but that thought still kept him awake for hours. He dreamt of the men he'd killed and dismembered in pursuit of Alvo returning to haunt him. One of the fun things about this rereading of Milestone comics, with fun being a deeply questionable adjective for a book as sour as Hardware, is the real-time evolution of the line. By the 9-month mark, the For Those Who Joined Us late box is a streamlined perpetual Marvel primer. First, it was about vengeance. Now it's about justice. Kurt Metcalf is the most brilliant inventor in the world, and his greatest invention is his armored alter ego, Hardware, originally intending to only destroy his enemies. Now Kurt uses his liquid metal armor, an endless array of high-tech weapons, to combat evil wherever he finds it. Before the format was set, though, they had a big first comic-style previous issue recap on the inside front cover. As recently as the previous issue, these captions were being integrated into individual story text and tweaked from month to month to take out typos and redundancies.
Curtis Metcalf overcame many obstacles to become the most brilliant inventor in the world, and now has Hardware, the high-tech dreadnought of vengeance. He seeks vengeance for himself and justice for others.
It's obvious that this title was done Hollywood style, where DC ponied up the money with an ironclad imminent start date. Milestone was still building the plane while it's flying. Icon and Hardware tend to be more focused and pioneering new stuff like the floating head caption boxes. Static is more like, the premise is teen superhero figuring it out with his friends, and you can do the same with this month's pitch. Lots of dialogue, light on plot. Blood Syndicate doesn't even have the premise down until number 5, randomly killing off its ostensive lead character. Growing pains are readily apparent, but also a firm rejection of formula. Most DC and Marvel heroes are set in stone after their first story. Only one enemy is clearly dead in Iron Man's origin tale, with most of the terrorists killed by Tony in the movie, but clearly self-defense. It has to take Curtis Metcalf months at minimum to develop hardware and methodically work his way toward Alba. He doesn't hesitate to kill and maim people toward that goal, but he suddenly sets a long-term abstract punishment for Alba once it comes time to actually murk the man. Some of this may be hurdles in turning concept into series, but really Metcalf has a personality meltdown after Alba dismisses him. His entire identity is shattered, triggering an obsessive mania that allows him a premeditated rampage that hits a wall at the concept of severing the relationship. Dwayne McDuffie and uncredited universe co-developer Jim Owsley had spent their entire early careers at Marvel. It's not hard to imagine them pitching Milestone, or maybe McDuffie asking for a piece of damage control and being laughed out of the offices. Hardware expresses that rage. Going ham was the thing to do at the time. We valued extreme. Whether intentionally or serendipitously, Hardware starts out doing what was expected, but almost immediately recoils and reconsiders. As much anger as he felt about being wronged, there's still love and conditioning. Curtis Metcalf and Tony Stark have similar arcs of finding heroism after being shaken out of their pampered delusion into a harsh reality in which they are culpable in wrongdoing. But Stark is more passive, and his journey is over after the origin. Hardware's has barely begun. Metcalf does not come from material privilege. He's essentially a mutant, gifted in extraordinary intelligence that alienates him from his moral, accomplished, but comparatively limited parents, not to mention Peter. He sees himself not in them, but in his surrogate parent, Edwin Alva. In an early adoption of metatext, McDuffie lays it all out for the audience, relitigating the superheroic ideal through a racial prism and recognition that the violence inherent in the genre precludes truly manifested heroism in favor of aggressive power/revenge fantasy. In a dream sequence, Curtis appears on Oprah Winfrey with all the mostly white women he used like Kleenex in a variety of respects. He was always wearing armor, even before becoming Hardware, and there's a reference to the Houston Astrodome I have to appreciate as a local. The exact line is, well, that just about does it for today. Be with us next time for a special show, live from the Houston Astrodome, where our audience will be made up entirely of white people who think that Curtis has a chip on his shoulder. With mainstream heroes, writers try to graft on internal conflicts that mostly bore readers because we know their hearts or whatever. Hardware is not a good guy. His narcissism has a body count. There's a serious question about whether he can redeem himself that's compelling. At first, it's novel that Metcalf has to strip naked before getting his liquid metal protective skin sprayed on. Now it's clearly a metaphor. He has to lay himself bare before he can even begin to consider attempting heroism. And it has to happen every single time. Come to Jesus.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the LEGIONPODCAST. I'm Murray. And
I'm Al, and this week we are talking about the Lobo appearance from the 2007 Brave and the Bold series by Mark Waid and George Perez. Issue 4 featuring Supergirl and Lobo. And why are we doing this? Because we're doing a crossover.
Right on.
Like all crossovers, it jumps right in the middle of whatever you're doing normally and skews it off.
Alrighty, folks. Well, that is it from us at Legion of Substitute Podcasters.
I'm a notoriously angry fanboy who is mean and hateful toward a lot of beloved properties. I don't hate Blue Beetle. He's too lame to inspire that strong of an emotion. Dan Garrett is the RC Cola of Golden Age superheroes. You recognize the brand, tastes okay, and has been around forever, but it's nobody's first choice. Night Owl was more or less the impotent everyman who doesn't accomplish much more than an erection in Watchmen. Ted Kord is arguably the least interesting concept among the Charlton action heroes, and the Peter Scolari to Booster's Tom Hanks in the JLI. He's the dollar store brand Spider-Man, another mediocre white guy on super teams with deep benches, because he can't really support the team, much less a solo title. He has just enough of a fandom to be resurrected, but he's no Barry Allen. His being dead made some middle-aged guys sad, so now he offers occasional tech support to actual lead superheroes and helps fill out the occasional crowd scene. Frankly, it's more than he deserves, but DC threw you a bone. It would be galling if the third hero based around an Egyptian scarab was another American, so they threw out the Egyptian mysticism angle entirely before doing just that. It turns out that the scarab was actually technology from ancient aliens that was so advanced as to appear to be magical. Yeah, secondhand Eric Von Daniken riff isn't racist at all. But deflection, the new guy is Latin American, so that's, pigmentally proximate? While Ted Kord's body was still cooling, Jaime Reyes was given the scarab after it fell off the Rock of Eternity or something during Infinite Crisis, the 20th anniversary direct sequel to the Crisis on Infinite Earths that first integrated Blue Beetle and his friends into DC continuity. Again, technically, you or I could at minimum reprint the Ditko Blue Beetle strips, if not outright use that character on the down low. Dynamite has been quietly doing that sort of thing for years now. Perhaps a more rights-conscious DC needed a fully owned and marketable Blue Beetle. Dan Didio knew Ted Kord was well-loved enough to get the same sort of rise out of people as his treatment of Sue and Ralph Dibny. Plus, he thought, with his weight problems and heart issues, Ted was due to be retired. Ditko was still alive in 2006, so it was too soon for him to spin in his grave over turning Blue Beetle into a Spider-Man clone, most specifically the Miles Morales one. Didio and the architects of Infinite Crisis wanted more minority representation, specifically Latino, and young at that. Didio took the idea to Keith Giffen, who was married to a Latina, and was more open than most creators to bold new directions involving a body count. Weirdly, Dan Garrett had only accessed a fragment of the Scarab's power, but when fully engaged, the Blue Beetle armor most resembled fellow JLIer Guy Gardner's short-lived warrior persona. In a time when only one Lantern power ring was in existence, following Hal Jordan's homicidal rampage in Emerald Twilight, creators still wanted Guy to have Green Lantern-like abilities. Ultimately, he was revealed to have alien ancestry and could morph his body into constructs similar to those he used to create from solid light. Mostly, he had armor, could fly, and created giant guns and melee weapons directly out of his arms and legs and such. Likewise, the Scarab was an artifact of aliens known as the Reach, who had an ancient conflict with the Green Lantern Corps, and whose armor could warrior. But also, Jaime Reyes was a teenager with an extended family in his El Paso home for flavor. Caliente! John Rogers was brought in to help write the series, and after a bunch of lackluster designs, Cully Hamner was brought in for the Mighty Morphin Beetleborg look and as initial series artist. I read Jaime's appearances in Infinite Crisis and bought the first issue as ongoing, but he just wasn't my character type. A new Peacemaker was developed for the series, which prompted me to buy the second trade paperback edition, but it just didn't hook me. I think Reyes' design is excellent, and the character is alright for what he is, Peter Parker by committee. Comics do desperately need better Latin representation, and though never setting the comics world on fire, I hope his upcoming motion picture wins me and general audiences over. It worked with Miles Morales, but he was already a big hit in comics that I never read, so I don't know who deserves the credit for Into the Spider-Verse. I'm just glad they stopped trying to shove Jaime into JLI revivals and Booster Gold pairings. So far, the kid has had the most success through his time on the Teen Titans and the animated series Batman Brave and the Bold and Young Justice, instead of trying to fit a Jaime-shaped Beetle into a Ted hole.
Tales of the Legion Project podcast, Brave and the Bold number 5 for JL May 2023. I am your host, Eric.
And I'm your host, Peter. So JL May is a podcast crossover event that started in 2016, spearheaded by the folks over at the Waiting for Doom podcast. It's a celebration of podcasting coming together, but also of, as the title implies, the Justice League of America. So in 2016, the very first crossover event took a look at JLA Year One by Mark Waid, speaking of Mark Waid, and Barry Kitson. And every podcast that participates takes a look at one issue, maybe two issues. But what they do is they divide up the issues of a title among the podcasters. And it's kind of like a round robin thing. You just go from one podcast to the next until you've listened to everybody talking about one particular issue in a title. JLA Year One, there's only 12. They might have thrown in some other things. I think some people did look at earlier Justice League Origins for that event. 2017, they took a look at Alex Ross's Justice series, also a 12-issue series.
I should go back and find those episodes then, because I'm currently rereading that series.
That's right. 2018, they took a look at the Silver Age 5th Week event. DC used to do a bunch of those. I used to like those. 2019, they did Blackest Night. I have to imagine the event and maybe some crossovers. I don't know if they did any in 2022, but 2023, we are back doing Brave and the Bold, the 2007 series.
That's a lot of podcast listening.
If you've ever wanted to read the series, it is on the DCU app. You could read along every day. Batman versus Legion of Superheroes. And we put it into a Tales because this is our way to to take a look at the Legion of Superheroes, usually outside of the normal publishing continuity that we're dealing with on the main feed. And then once we're done, or once you're done with this episode, go and listen to the coverage for issue 6, which can be found and produced by Teal Productions, hosted by Ed Moore, over on the Comic Book Noise family feed.
September 2009 cover dated The Brave and the Bold number 25 continued a 3-issue run of done-in-ones combining the DC and Milestone characters. The first dozen issues of the series featured round-robin pairings that developed into an overarching tale by Mark Waid, George Perez, and Jerry Ordway. Sales probably weren't what they should have been for that caliber of talent, plus Waid started having friction with DC editorial at some point. After a follow-up quartet of contained combinations, mostly with the more budget-friendly Scott Collins, Waid was out. As of this recording, we're still waiting for some partner podcast to fill in the details of this period, but we should eventually have all the chapters of that run covered for your listening enjoyment. Next up was a Supergirl Raven 2-parter by Marv Wolfman and Phil Winslade, and then another paired pairing of Green Lantern Hal Jordan and the Phantom Stranger. The same creative team of that second story, David Hine and Doug Braithwaite, then offered another Green Lantern 2-parter, this time with fellow hard-traveling hero Green Arrow. I'm not sure if those 4 issues connect or not, as that coverage isn't supposed to start until JL May the 19th. The 23rd issue is another single-issue story by Dan Jurgens with Booster Gold and Magog, 2 of my most favoritist characters ever if this was Bizarro World, but I'm certain Shag will make the best of that on his JLI podcast. My entries in this media crossover are all single-issue stories by different creative teams, linked only by the Milestone theme, without anything leading into or out of them. Since I'm not releasing 3 complete podcasts in as many days, I was able to cover issue number 24 among the first batch of JL May shows, and then space my episodes out bi-weekly over the extended 31-day month, giving breathing room for other shows like the Marvel Superhero Podcast's coverage of the Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3, and next week, Dark Horse Presents Aliens. We'll look at the Stronghold miniseries by Major Bummer creative team, John Arcudi and Doug Monkey, the latter a longtime JLA and Green Lantern artist, so there's some thematic association for that second one. But if you're interested, those other shows are on the main explicit Rolled Spine podcast feed. DC Bloodlines, along with our other clean language shows, which is mostly just me working solo on comic book stuff, are on the more family-friendly 4-color Rolled Spine feed. Not that your family cares to hear a bunch of middle-aged people thinking way too hard about 15-year-old stories 35 times in 1 month. Anyway, I don't have a direct lead in, and that's not out yet anyway, so here's my acknowledgement of them. My issues are just filler material ahead of the arrival of the permanent and final creative team on the book, J. Michael Straczynski and Jesus Saiz, which also, to my knowledge, sticks to self-contained stories. The second week of JL May releases were a little light, so if you want to get a jump on those, Once Upon a Geek has already released the Green Lantern Dr. Fate episode with guest Keith G. Baker. Ted Speaks has done Adam and the Joker. Aquaman and the Demon were covered by Robin Shag on the first Fire and Water podcast in nearly 2 years. And Right On Network Presents has done their second Wonder Woman episode, this time with Zatanna and Batgirl in tow. I'll be back with Julio Raul for the final of DC Bloodlines' participation in JL May 2023, technically a Spectre zombie story, but mostly an excuse to continue our coverage of the Milestone titles through to their first clash with the DC Universe when worlds collide. Getting back to the matter at hand, though, System Compatibility was written by Adam Beechen, a screenwriter for numerous popular cartoons, which translated well to his being a longtime scripter of DC Comics' adaptations of the Justice League Unlimited and Batman Beyond shows. To my knowledge, he had no prior history with Jaime Reyes, but most of his comics work involves young heroes like Robin, the Teen Titans, Batgirl, and Gen 13. Artist Roger Robinson had done some hard case and prototype for Malibu Comics, but no hardware. He had long runs on Azrael and Batman Gotham Knights, and I personally really enjoy his work, but he never seemed to break in a big way. His highest profile recent effort was the series Noble for Lion Forge. I remind you again that I'm an old, and Noble ended before the pandemic, which Robinson had already exited in 2018. I don't even think Lion Forge is a thing anymore, right? A complaint that I've heard on some of the other podcasts, especially the Right On crew regarding Wonder Woman and Power Girl, is that creators will sometimes bring out the worst in involved heroes to manufacture conflict and highlight the differences between the properties. It's not as bad here, but I've never heard Jaime drop so many dated references or such corny teen speak, while Hardware is too manipulative a personality to be so openly hostile without cause. Kurt Metcalf is driven, but pragmatic, and has only gotten this aggressive with other heroes as part of a play, which we'll address more in the next episode. The premise is that the System is running prototype exosuits from Mexico to El Paso, Texas, which is the Blue Beetle's turf. Hardware doesn't want him involved in his ongoing dispute with Elvin Alba, but Beetle ignores him. That's for the best, because the new systematic Mark III armor more than holds its own against the Dreadnought of Justice, was it? It also has an added gimmick of being able to instantly drain Hardware's power reserves. Given what a thorn Hardware has been in the system's side, I'm not sure why the Mark III didn't kill him while he was immobile, but the pod is supposedly considered the delivery to be more important. Shadowy figures monitoring the action by remote feed may not concur, as the whole point of this mission appears to be observing Hardware and creative effective countermeasures, which wouldn't be needed if you cut off his head while he was lying flat on his belly in the Chihuahuan desert sand. So Blue Beetle deploys these tendril things from his fingertips that serve as both jumper and USB cables. Hardware is instantly back to 100% power, but also miffed that the alien suit had hacked his own. Jaime didn't understand what the Scarab had accessed and apologized for its extra initiative. Needing to recover lost ground, Jaime suggests meeting with local crime lordess Ladama, one of the main adversaries across 3 volumes of Blue Beetle solo titles. Jaime rightly surmised that System was sending the armors to Ladama's enemies in Intergang, and she wrote down the address to a suspect warehouse. Hardware rightly pointed out that Ladama was playing Beetle, using him to keep the suits out of Intergang hands instead of rescuing her own forces. Our heroes crashed the meet, and when the Mark III tried to depower Hardware again, he revealed that it only took $7 of wiring from Radio Shack to shield his power source. So I guess technological superheroes rigging up quick fixes from an electronics store is another thing Amazon has forever ruined. Then the Mark III managed to temporarily wreck the computing of both heroes' armor with magnets or something. So Beetle did his human centipede thing with Hardware again, and they took it out with one blast. Yeah, let's not have Beechen do any more tech-heavy books, okay? He's displaying insane clown posse level expertise in the sciences here. Hardware scoots from the suits, begrudging mutual respect between the heroes, yada yada. The story ends back at System HQ, with the 2 shadowy bald guy observers. The one you probably figured was Lex Luthor was just an anonymous system guy. The other one, a paid consultant, pointed out that they now had everything they needed to build the extra scary and alien-looking systematic Mark X. See, Hardware had set up how his enemies would work their way to his level, so he just had to keep moving the goalposts. But supposedly the Mark X would be too huge a leap for him to grapple with, because 10 is 7 more than 3. The big last page splash reveal was that the consultant was a new, non-little person incarnation of Gizmo from the Fearsome 5. His last line suggests that he's Gizmo's son, or at least a family relation, but I guess most people figured Gizmo reproduced through contact with water. It doesn't really matter, because Milestone's brief revival within the DC universe ends next issue. This version of DC continuity ends 2 years later, and I don't think the Mark X or Gizmo Jr. make any other appearances. Yeah, that ending didn't land as intended, but this was probably a paycheck gig anyway. Maybe hire an actual Milestone guy next time? Oh wait, they did.
Howdy, welcome to the Newsprint Commando. I'm your host, Ed Moore. I am setting aside my current voyage through Aerosol, Harrier, and Pacific Comics to participate in this year's J.L. May project. This year's focus is the 2007 series The Brave and the Bold, and I will be taking a look at issue 6 of that series, Green Lantern and Batman. If you want to get in touch, you can tweet me at Teal Productions and News P Commando. Teal Productions on Facebook also is where I post these episodes. I am indieman@gmail.com is the email address. Comicbooknoise-TNC Tango November Charlie is the website, and there are forums at justanotherfanboy.freeforums.net. If you do want to continue following J.L. May, installment number 7, issue number 7, will be discussed on the Right On Network. I hope I didn't do too badly, especially compared to this rather awesome list of people that are going to be involved. Next up for me in just a handful of days, we'll be looking at Star Slayer number 2 from Pacific Comics. And with that, I must bid you adieu.
If you enjoyed the music used in this episode, please go out and legally download Bloodlines by Ministry, Honky Tonk Train Blues by Mead Lux Lewis, Rhapsody in Blue by George Gershwin and the Paul Whiteman Orchestra, Nitro by LL Cool J, Hardware Instrumental by Black Thought, Cities by the Moody Blues, Clockwork by Black Alicious, The Ugly Bug Ball by Los Lobos, Simmons Incorporated by Run DMC, Holocaust Silkworm by RZA, and Bourgeois Blues by Pete Seeger. Thanks for the support of Adam Ironberry, Alex M., Dr. Ange, The Bat Pod, Between the Pages, Billy Hines, who added, I enjoy these podcasts about comics I haven't read as much as I do the ones about comics I have read. Chris at Bad Books for Beginners, Chris Lydon, Coffee and Comics Podcast, Dave's Comic Heroes Blog, Ed Moore, Fog Weaver, History of Comics on Film, The Irredeemable Shag, Julio Raul Super Turbo, Keith G. Baker, Kitos 2, Cristados, Laurel at Mountain Flower 1, Longbox Crusade, Outcasters, The Batman and the Outsiders Podcast, Pavel L., Range Ranger Gord, Culture Wars Draft Dodger, the Relatively Geeky Podcast Network, Resurrections and Adam Warlock and Thanos Podcast, Roger Preeb, Sean Merrick, Siskoid, Steve Sellers, Tim Price the Podcrasher, Vito Vote, Willie Arbro, and the Right On Network.
Welcome to the Right On Network presents JL May 2023. This episode, we are covering The Brave and the Bold issue 7 from October of 2007. I am your host, Laurel, and along with me is Diane. Hello, Diane.
Hello, Laurel.
And hello to you too, founder of the Right On Network, AJ.
Laurel, Diane, hello. Hello, everyone. I'm happy to be here.
Hello. Now, the three of us normally do the Huntress podcast, so we are very happy to be on this special JL May episode. The list of all the podcasts participating this year is huge. I mean, it is really long. So search for JL May or JL May 2023 in your podcatcher of choice, and you should be able to find the episodes that will be released throughout May. We're going to do Brave and the Bold number 7. It stars Wonder Woman and Power Girl. It's really nice to be included in the podcast community because there's so many people, like I said, there's like, I don't know, 20 or 30. I can't even, some of them repeat, so it's a little bit tricky to figure out where everybody is because like us, we're doing too. But man, they got every issue of this series covered. It's really wild. So I hope people can find it. The next issue number 8, is on the Fanholes podcast. That's one word, Fanholes podcast. So you can look for the next issue there.
The Blue Beetle is a Fox feature appearing in Mystery Men Comics magazine. The Blue Beetle is on the air twice a week on this same station. Consult the broadcast schedule in your local newspapers. Don't forget to listen in.
The preceding DC Comics related program is a non-profit fan production. Any copyrighted materials therein are believed covered under fair use, and no copyright infringement is intended. Please leave your comments on the DC Bloodlines blog, the Rolls Bind Podcast's WordPress page, via email at emailofdiabalu@yahoo.com, or you can tweet the host directly on the Twitters at Commander Blanks, spelled with an X. You can also talk to the whole Rolled Spine gang on the Twitters at Rolled Spine. We hope you enjoyed our little program, and remember, spill the blood!